We've got this really stubborn, persistent deficit, and we've got this looming fiscal tidal wave in the shape of an aging population. We actually have to get serious about this. And that's just not happening. When people look at Britain and they look at Westminster, they see people who, in some sense, just aren't dealing in reality anymore. If you're getting off a plane and there are 5 armed men, maybe some women, standing there waiting for you to take you into detention, you're going to think, now this is like an arms dealer, or it's a terrorist, or it's someone who's wanted for murder. I looked at these tweets, and I mean, they're very mild, frankly.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today, I'm joined, as usual, by our Executive Director, Tom Clougherty, and also by our Editorial Director, Kristian Niemietz, who, for those of you listening online, seems to be wearing a shirt stolen from Pablo Escobar. So do write your comments on those down in the description. Today, we'll be discussing whether Britain is a fiscal saint or fiscal sinner, a new tax proposed by the government on housing, and freedom of speech. Is it good or bad? If you do want more of our content, do remember to subscribe to IEA Insider, the link to which should be in the description. Okay, so without any further ado, our first topic is based on an FT article by Chris Giles, which essentially argues that Britain is not as fiscally cooked as is often claimed. Tom, do you buy this article?
Well, I think that the article is a sort of valid article, and actually it provides a little bit of context, I suppose. Now, we've talked a lot about Britain's fiscal situation on this podcast, and we've been pretty overwhelmingly negative about it, even though I've said, I think, in recent weeks, this idea that we're going to need a bailout from the IMF or something, that seems to be over-egging the pudding a little bit. It's more that we're slowly boiling a frog, I think, in fiscal terms, than that we are approaching some kind of everything is about to break down crisis point. So Chris Giles basically points out, and these are all correct points, right, that our deficit is lower than that of the United States, and unlike theirs, ours is set to fall in the years ahead. Our debt is lower than some other big economies like Japan and Italy. And actually, he says, our economic growth has exceeded expectations this year. Now, they may have been extremely low expectations, but again, that's possibly true that we're doing better than some people were forecasting, although, of course, there's still time for it to go horribly wrong. At the same time, though, we've got the highest borrowing costs on long-term debt since 1998, and our short and medium-term borrowing costs are the highest in the G7, that group of major economies. So this is a quote from Chris Giles, which I think is quite good. He says it takes a special sort of political, institutional, and economic dysfunction to achieve these results, where effectively we're not doing as badly as many other countries, and yet the markets, it seems, are treating us as though we are. And so there's an interesting conundrum here. And in the article, I think, again, it's valuable to point these things out. He says one of the reasons that it's expensive for us to borrow is not so much to do with the fiscal situation, but it's about the way that demand from defined benefit pension schemes for long-dated gilts has basically just collapsed because many of these things are closed to new entrants. So as their customers or their clients, whatever you would call them, reach retirement age, they don't need to buy as many gilts as they did before. This has coincided, of course, with the Bank of England reversing or starting to reverse its quantitative easing program, where it had bought an awful lot of government gilts. It's now trying to sell them back into the market. Again, this is something that will sort of increase the supply of government debt, along with government borrowing a lot. And you've got issues, so the central bank is no longer buying government debt, and pension funds aren't buying government debt to the same degree. So there's a sort of specific British thing going on here, the mechanics of the gilt markets, which says more about that than it does about the overall fiscal situation. I mean, Chris Giles also suggests, and I think this is we can argue about this one a little bit more, but part of the problem is that we have 2 fiscal events a year. This apparently is quite unusual. Most countries will have sort of an annual fiscal forecast, an economic forecast, and then they'll update it the following year. Because we have them spaced roughly 6 months apart, and we see this at the moment because it's what we talk about every week, we are stuck in this endless cycle of speculation about what are the growth figures, what are the inflation figures, is the government meeting its fiscal rules or not, Chris Giles also points out that our fiscal rules are based on a forecast of what's going to happen in 5 years' time, which is very uncertain, quite volatile, and ultimately we're never actually going to hit those forecasts made 5 years in advance. The whole thing is a little bit of a fiction. So his prescription here is that we should issue less long-term debt. I don't really know about that, but he says that other countries issue less of it than we do, and I believe him. Possibly the Bank of England should consider stopping its quantitative tightening program. Now, look, I actually agree with that as well, though not for fiscal reasons. I think probably the stance of monetary policy is still a little bit too tight, even though inflation is stubbornly high. But you've always got to think that monetary policy works with that famously long and variable lag. So you're not really setting monetary policy for what's in front of you right now. You're setting it for what is 18 months, 2 years down the line. He says we should have one fiscal event per year. Again, I think that would probably be sensible. We never used to have two. And I think this whole process of doing fiscal policy as an act of political theatre, as basically a way of generating headlines every 6 months, is just a really bad way to set tax and spending policy. And again, this I definitely don't agree with. He thinks that because we do need because we need fiscal tightening of one sort or another, his view, expressed in the FT, is that Rachel Reeves this autumn should announce deferred tax increases. So tax increases will go up in future so that we balance the books 5 years out. But not yet, everybody, don't worry. Now, this seems sort of politically naive, and I'm not sure it would be economically very successful either to warn everybody that there were big tax increases coming.
Also right before an election.
Well, it's presumably right before an election. So actually, how credible is that as well? So as I say, I think that this is a useful antidote to some of the real doom-mongering that we've had recently. And it is worth bearing in mind that even if we are in a bad situation, other countries are doing as badly or in some respects worse than we are. But equally, is that something we should draw too much comfort from? I'm not sure. So I think basically, to sum this up, we do have some very deep-seated problems that require serious structural reforms. I think if you read this piece by Chris Giles and say, oh, everything's fine, we needn't worry about it, this is just various contingent factors, not a big deal, we're doing fine, that would be completely the wrong takeaway here. But if you say, you know what, we're not heading towards an absolute fiscal meltdown, we're not going to have an immediate funding crisis, we're not going to have to call in the IMF, all of those things I think are probably correct. But nevertheless, we have big long-term problems and we need to do some serious proper thinking and acting about how we change those and how we change the future trajectory of the state's fiscal costs and how we get growth up. Well, then that would be a sensible outcome.
Yeah. Kristian, do you agree? Fiscal meltdown unlikely?
Well, probably not a total meltdown, but nonetheless, I wasn't convinced by the article. It seemed to me he was trying to do the equivalent of what Fraser Nelson did for the crime statistics, saying, look, everyone talks about how terrible it is. Look here, I'm the antidote. I'm the contrarian voice in the wilderness who says, no, actually, I've looked at the figures and things are, well, I mean, not fine. That's not the way he would phrase it, but far better than people think. Except that in the case of crime, that discrepancy between the figures and the perception is real. So Fraser Nelson was able to construct a decent argument on that basis. In Chris Giles's case, it looked a bit made up, a bit contrived. So firstly, okay, there's this comparison with Italy and Japan. It's true, their fiscal situation is even worse, but you can always find somebody who's doing even worse. You could also say, oh, Argentina was doing even worse in 2001. Okay, not much of a consolation. It's just that among the G20 countries is always, when we talk about high levels of debt, is always Japan that's singled out as the worst example. And more recently, since the Eurozone crisis, Italy too. So he's looking here specifically at the least ambitious comparisons. And says we're doing a bit better. Well, okay, quite a bit better than those. Okay, that's not much of an argument. And as far as I can tell, nobody ever said we are the absolute worst in the world. But perhaps more importantly, on the fiscal events, the fiscal forecasts. Okay, there his argument seems to be basically we talk too much about the fiscal situation. If we had fiscal conditions like in the 1990s or 2000s, it wouldn't matter how many fiscal forecasts we have. If they mostly show that things are okay, that the budget deficit is under control, that the total debt level is stable or even coming down, then it wouldn't matter how many fiscal forecasts we do. We could have one every 5 minutes and it would be okay. Or if we had the fiscal conditions of, say, the Swiss federal government, there it wouldn't matter how often they talk about the fiscal situation. And the same goes for the fiscal rules. Okay, they create this impression and speculation and all that. But again, if the underlying conditions are okay, then it doesn't really matter in what way you talk about it and frame the debate. So no, I wasn't convinced by the article.
Yeah. How do you respond to his point that the US, for example, has a significantly higher budget deficit than Britain and most other European countries, and yet its level of growth has been pretty healthy by comparison to Britain's, certainly over the last 10 years.
True, but then that has also been true for quite some time, and they are in a different position, having the world's reserve currency. They have always been able to borrow at levels that basically no other country could. That's why, so even in the 1980s, even Reaganomics, where it's often compared to Thatcherism as seen as just the North American variant of it, in fiscal terms, it was totally different. They had massive budget deficits, exploding debt levels in the 1980s, and they are just able to get away with the level of borrowing that other countries are not.
Yeah. I think one of the things I've been thinking about recently is why is Britain seemingly being singled out by financial markets? Why are we being treated as if, our debt is a lot more risky than perhaps it may appear, or at least that it would appear on the basis of what Chris Giles has written? And obviously he's pointed to, and I've recounted some of the sort of specific underlying factors around pensions and central bank monetary policy, which may be having an influence there. But I think if you leave those to one side for a second, I think one of the reasons that people are seemingly losing faith in the UK, in a way, it's not about the reality, because ultimately, could we balance the books? Yes, we could cut the spending. Perfectly possible. We could raise taxes. I wouldn't want to, but we could raise taxes on ordinary workers, income tax, VAT or whatever, and we could balance the books that way. The government doesn't have a kind of inherent funding crisis. The money is there on the one hand, or the money could be saved on the other. I think what people are losing faith in is the ability of government to actually make difficult choices and carry them through. And I think when people look at Britain and they look at Westminster, they see people who in some sense just aren't dealing in reality anymore. That maybe one side will say we can just cut taxes and everything will be fine. And the other side will say we can just spend as much as we like and everything will be fine. And no one is really saying, actually, we've got this really stubborn, persistent deficit, and we've got this looming fiscal tidal wave in the shape of an aging population. We actually have to get serious about this. And that's just not happening. I think that there is a perception that British policymakers will just sort of extend and pretend ad infinitum rather than ever grapple with the fundamental issue there. And I'm not saying necessarily, are our politicians worse than politicians anywhere else in the world? Is our politics more detached from reality? I'm not sure. I kind of doubt it. But equally, I can easily see why people look at a kind of political dysfunction here and think, I don't know, that's not where I'm going to put my money.
Yeah. How much do you buy into the argument that I think Stephen Bush has made a few times in the FT, that actually part of this doomerism is an aspect of politicians being unwilling to make decisions, that the political class sort of actually emphasizes the idea that we're doomed, there's nothing we can do about this, we've tried nothing and we're running out of ideas. Is there an element that being sort of too doom-laden is actually quite helpful for politicians who just don't actually want to take decisions that are politically inconvenient?
Well, I mean, I guess, look, it allows them to say, this isn't really our fault. We inherited this mess. And frankly, there's nothing that we can do about it. We're just doing our best in a tough situation. And I think, that's certainly where the Conservatives were by the end of their time in government. Labour seems to have got there really in a hurry this time around. And I don't know, there was another piece in the FT. It may have been in the same slot the following day from Chris Giles's piece by Jan and Ganesh, who we often mention because he writes quite perceptive articles for the FT. And he was basically describing Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, as sort of an end of an era figure. Actually, the argument of his article was, if you want to have kind of a radical structural reform package, a kind of a break from the preceding era, basically the right has to be seen to try and fail, and then the left has to be seen to try and fail with the status quo, by the way. And then once they've both failed, then the public will realize, well, it's not just because the people I hate are the bad guys or the people we hate are the bad guys. It's actually that the way you're trying to do things doesn't work anymore, and you need to come up with something different and radical and break from the status quo. And, he's saying this is why, in a sense, you had to have sort of Nixon fail and then Carter fail before you could get Reagan, or you had to have Heath fail and then Callahan fail before you could get Thatcher. Maybe both sides have to have a go.
Yeah.
And try their different flavors of the mainstream approach. And then when they're both seen to fail by the public, maybe then there's an appetite for something different. People will realize, okay, we don't just have to change the personalities, we have to change the approach.
Yeah. So a sort of accelerationist case for Keir Starmer.
Well, I don't know if it's accelerationist. It may in a sense be, in a way, almost process-driven, that this is just a stage of the grieving process for the old status quo or something that we have to go through, that a sort of obviously competent and decent person from the different political tradition that had power before has to be given a go. And only when he comes up short can we try something different.
Yeah, but there is the problem that there's this meme of people at different points of the political compass all at the same time thinking, I hope this whole thing collapses soon and then my ideology will pervade it.
You will,
and can go badly wrong. It could well be that I think we've talked about this before, that if you compare the present situation to the 1970s or so, there was more of a recognition that what happened at the time was Britain had a mixed economic model, somewhere between a market economy and a socialist economy, and had traveled pretty far in the socialist direction, at least compared to, say, the 1930s. And that model was running out of steam. Nowadays, we have the problem that, even though obviously from our perspective, Britain today isn't a particularly liberal economy, the perception is that it is. And there is a strong narrative that we still have, that just because after Margaret Thatcher, there wasn't a very coherent ideological project, that we just don't know how to label anything that happened since then. And therefore, a lot of people think, well, okay, in the 80s, Thatcherism may turn Britain into what they would call a neoliberal economy. Since then, well, I don't really know how to label that. Let's just say it's all Thatcherism. So since 1979, everything has been Thatcherism. And then you have the perception, and we often get this, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, when you have external speaking engagements, that there will always be someone in the audience saying, well, you guys have been in charge for over 40 years. You're basically running the country. This is your mess. You broke it, you own it. What we need is Corbynism.
I wish I'd known I was actually running the country all this time. I mean, I might have done something.
I thought it was the Resolution Foundation.
Well, I was in The Economist this week, and that was a good article too.
Yeah. Oh, it's good we bring in The Economist. Otherwise, people think we're being sponsored by the FT.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Although, if the FT is interested in sponsoring the IEA podcast, we're very open to that.
They could even just give us some free subscriptions. That'd be nice enough. Yeah, that'd be a sod.
Yeah. Okay, well, this actually moves us quite nicely on to another area where the government seems to actively be trying to make their fiscal situation worse by inhibiting growth through essentially imposing a new tax on landfills. So, Kristian, you read this Substack by Ben Hopkinson at the CPS. What do you make of this change? And can you explain what these changes are?
Yeah, first of all, this is something that before reading this article, didn't even know that such a thing existed. And this is, I've been thinking for a while, maybe we should have a publication called the 10 or 20 or 100 most important policies that you've never heard of, because, sometimes we think of the things that dominate the headlines as driving outcomes. Sometimes it's a technocratic thing that some nerdy thing that most people, 99% of the population, will never have heard of, that can have a big impact. And this is one of those issues where, so apparently the way landfill duties work is that they are somewhat related to the environmental risk that different types of waste pose. And fair enough, if you throw away something that takes ages or that might contaminate the soil around it, you pay a higher duty for that than for, say, just lumps of concrete or so, something that has no obvious impact on what happens around it. And right now, sections of the government seem to see this lower duty rate as a kind of tax rebate. So the lower rate for non-poisonous, non-hazardous materials as a kind of tax rebate. And they're saying, well, why don't we just cut that rebate and raise some tax revenue? Sounds nice. It's just that if you do that, you will make several types of construction suddenly a lot more expensive, because especially the kind of construction where you do need to dispose large quantities of concrete and other building materials. Yes. And it means for a lot of projects, you suddenly have an explosion in the tax bill that they didn't anticipate. So several projects might no longer be viable. And especially in the construction sector in London, because there you have, of course, more high-rise building than anywhere else in the country. The structure of development is completely different. So changes of that nature will have a disproportionate impact here. And this could go even just the fact that they're speculating about it. It hasn't happened yet, but just the speculation could already have an impact on willingness to invest in various projects, and that then adds to, well, what is already happening, which is that there has been a tightening of various building regulations, where especially the kind of building that you get in London is getting a lot more expensive. And it is true that in London specifically, house building rates have completely collapsed, and this shouldn't happen, right? If the thing about building regulations is, and okay, I have to admit, this is something I've completely neglected so far. I've written tons about housing. I've never really mentioned building regulations very much, or maybe in a footnote somewhere, because I've always thought, well, okay, if you look at the breakdown of the costs of construction, or say the cost of a house nowadays, the single biggest component by far nowadays is clearly the land value. And of that specifically, it's the value of the permission. That's clearly the biggest thing. And everything else I thought so far is basically just a footnote. You can, if you make more land available for development and also bring in some kind of regulation that increases construction costs, well, okay. Willingness to pay is so much higher than construction costs because of all the pent-up demand. I thought all of this stuff doesn't really matter. So this is the sort of thing that we can maybe deal with once we have a land market that works, where you have large quantities of land being released for development. And then we can say if say land values fall from, I think it's somewhere like 60-something% of the value of a property. Yeah. If it falls to, say, historically, it was in the single-digit figures. Yeah. If it falls to that, then we can say, okay, now we can talk about building regulations. But so far, thought, well, a bit of a luxury issue. Clearly not anymore. So in London in particular, and there's a new building regulator where I think it was our colleague Samuel Hughes from the CPS who wrote about this. He says the rejection rate of that building regulator is insanely high, far higher than of the planning system as a whole. And what that means is, applying for a permit of that nature is in itself costly. You wouldn't willingly risk being rejected. So that can only mean two things. If the rejection rate is high, it can mean that that regulator has massive discretionary powers, so that you just cannot anticipate how can I do it in the wrong way or in the right way, that it's a Kafkaesque situation. Or it could mean that nobody knows how to do it, that it's not even that they are ill-intentioned or anything. It's just that the rules are so unclear that you cannot know in advance. Does this have any chance of getting through or not?
Yeah, this is one of the big complaints about so the new building safety regulator has to approve buildings that are higher than 7 stories, basically. And that obviously hits London house building grossly disproportionately to the rest of the country because you have more flats. And yeah, I think the rejection rate at the moment is 70%. And that's on top of average waits of about 9 months to even be able to get a decision. So it both slows everything down, even if it's approved, and then you also have a significant rate of rejection. And that's why, in part, in the first half of this year, only 2,158 houses new houses were started in the whole of London, which is obviously well below the level that you'd need to meet sort of continuously expanding demand. Tom, what did you make of all of this?
Yeah, well, I suppose, and again, we talked about this in the context of debt. How are we seemingly doing so much worse when the fundamentals may not be as bad as certain other countries? It takes a particular kind of political dysfunction to bring this about. And again, here you can look at London, in many respects still a sort of booming city, a massive economic magnet, where floor space is incredibly expensive. Right. And there is huge pent up demand to live here, to work here, to build here. And yet we're not getting even close to the housing targets that London is meant to meet. So, in fact, I think we're at about 5% of the housing target, which a lot of people complained when it was introduced was already much too low for the kind of demand and the pent up demand that was there. So we're at like 5% and falling. This seems to be a kind of real magic that we've managed to work to take what should be a very hot market and make it ice cold. And, I just want to put this landfill thing in a bit of perspective and talk about the scale of the tax increase that's being proposed here. So at the moment, if you're in construction and you have some construction waste to get rid of, so what they would call inert waste, so I guess bricks and concrete and soil and clay and rubble. And by the way, a lot of this stuff does get recycled anyway. I have no idea whether it's economically sensible to recycle more of this stuff or less of this stuff, but that's, in a way why we have price signals. But at the moment, you pay just over £4 per tonne to get rid of this inert waste in a landfill site, or you can pay absolutely nothing at all if you use it to fill in a quarry.
Yeah.
So
we want,
which you probably do want, if they've dug a lot of inert stuff out of the quarry, and why don't we fill it back up with some other inert stuff?
Yeah,
fine, right? So they're going to get rid of the quarry exemption.
Aren't they
proposed at the moment?
Consulting on that?
Well, they may just be consulting on that, but also the tax rate for inert waste is going to go up from £4.05, where it is at the moment, to £126.15 over the next 5 years. Per tonne.
Yeah.
And that's the standard rate that is applied to what they call active waste. So pretty much normal stuff that households and businesses are throwing away. And that higher rate is going to rise faster than the rate of inflation as well. So depending on how you look at it, this is either an infinite tax increase on disposing of construction rubble, or it's a 3,000% increase, depending on whether your starting point is 0 or £4. And so this is going to add tens of thousands of pounds to the construction cost of any given housing unit. This is a big deal.
I've seen figures of between 22,000 and 28,000 per house.
Sure.
Basically.
Yeah.
Which is just what we need. I do often think houses are a bit too cheap in Britain.
Yeah.
And if we just, people can eat the 28,000 quite easily.
Yeah. Well, except, of course, they can't. And I know you're being sort of sarcastic and provocative there. But it's not the only way that we're adding cost into the housing system at the moment. I mean, this is one of the other things that I've just been sort of chatting with people about recently, that we're almost bending over backwards to make housing construction unviable in a country that desperately needs more housing construction and especially needs it in London. And so Kristian referred to the thread that Samuel Hughes put on Twitter. As he was at the CPS, he's at Works in Progress now, and he's well worth following because he posts lots of pictures of pretty buildings and everything else, and he's also an extremely smart and perceptive guy. But, there are these background factors. There are obviously macroeconomic factors which might be depressing house building and construction. We have low growth, high borrowing costs, etc., etc. That's fine. Well, it's not fine, but we understand that that's there in the background. You have the planning system, right? We've talked about that plenty. That is a long-running background constraint. And you also have these affordable housing targets where developers are required to make a certain rather high percentage of any new project affordable, which basically means they have to sell a certain percentage of their properties below market rate.
Yeah.
That will tend to push up the prices of the other one or render projects completely unviable if they can't get enough for the non-affordable homes to make the whole project work financially. But then we've got the building safety regulator. We've got the second staircases rule, which even on the government's own impact assessment, the costs of would exceed the benefits by nearly 300 times. A lot of people think that was too low, but we'll leave that aside. You've massively tightened up on rules that require flats to be dual aspect, so to have windows on both sides, which I'll admit is a very pleasant thing to have. It's also a very expensive thing to have.
Because it reduces the amount of space, like the amount of...
Like, exactly. You cannot use the space in an apartment building as efficiently if every flat has to face out in two directions. Look, if you go into most American apartment buildings, you will have a long corridor with flats on each side, and half of them will face out one way and half of them will face out the other, and then you can just have a bunch of lifts in the middle to access both sides of the building. Is it the most aesthetically pleasing? No. Is it unpleasant to live in? No. Basically, it just means if you've got all the windows at one end, probably the bathrooms and the kitchen in most of these flats will not have natural light, but then it's more kind of open plan, so it's fine anyway, I suppose. But look, these are things that the market should dictate, not government planners. If people want to pay more to have dual aspect flats or, wall-to-wall windows on every side of the building, they can live in a glass cube if they're willing to pay for it. But if the government is there saying, you know what, I think it would be nice if people had windows on two sides of their homes rather than one, but then they don't think about, does this render a huge amount of construction either unviable or just much more expensive than it needs to be? Does this mean we can't use space as efficiently? That's a problem. It has a real cost. We've basically abolished or in the process of abolishing the old leasehold system. A lot of people won't mourn its passing. It probably was historically very useful, but it has long since been messed up by subsequent legislative developments. But again, the point Samuel makes on Twitter is we're getting rid of leasehold, which is the sort of tenure system that most flats operate on in the UK. But we haven't actually got a viable alternative yet. Common hold, which is meant to be the future alternative, just doesn't really work. And it requires a few legislative fixes before it's ready to go. We're not doing that. And then you add this landfill thing on top. And I said it takes a particular kind of political dysfunction to take what should be an extremely hot housing market in a booming city and freeze it in a block of ice. And that increasingly is what the government and the local authorities are managing to do. And I think the reason this is worth talking about is because we always talk about the planning system. And of course, with the Institute of Economic Affairs, we have a particular kind of animosity towards the whole idea of planning, of top-down central planning as opposed to spontaneous order, right? But this isn't so much planning. This is just bureaucracy. This is so much sand in the wheels of progress and commerce that you can't get going at all. And in a way, I look at this and, okay, you do see in the planning system concerted attempts to frustrate development, to stop things from happening. Might not be the intention of the planner, but it's certainly the intention of all of the interest groups and the NIMBYs who get involved. Here, I don't detect this so much. What I do detect is a lot of people doing things which on the micro level, it seems, well, why not? Why wouldn't we do this? This is a helpful thing. You add it all up and it creates a massive problem. And I think actually that is the regulatory state writ large in Britain. It's not a conspiracy against the public interest. Most of the time, it's people doing what they think is a good and sensible thing. But the cumulative effect can be really quite catastrophic.
Yeah. And also just growth doesn't really seem to be a consideration at all.
No, well, I mean, we always say we're putting growth first. This government's defining mission is growth. But that talk is cheap, right? And what would it mean to put that into action? It would mean saying, when all of these different ideas come up, which may have some ostensible justification, sure, I'd like buildings to be as safe as possible. Someone has to say, yes, but our priority is growth. And is this other thing that you want to do really so valuable that we should give up the economic growth or the reduction in living costs that we could otherwise have? There are trade-offs involved in everything. I mean, that's basically the core of economics, isn't it? There are always trade-offs, but so often policymakers either refuse to acknowledge the trade-offs or they do acknowledge them and then they just flat out ignore them and think they can have their cake and eat it too.
And the dual aspect rules in particular, this may be one of those examples where the dysfunctions in the housing market become self-perpetuating. Because since we have such high costs for housing, what often happens is you get a big gap between what people say in surveys, how they would like to live, and how they actually live. And then the kind of argument that you've just presented, well, this is all choices. You can have the market offers this, the market offers that. And of course, this one costs a bit more because it's a premium product. That rhetoric works for, say, in areas where most people feel they really do have choices. Say, in the car market, it would be strange if we had a car design code where you tell the car makers that they have to make the windows a certain size or something that we agree is aesthetically pleasing if you legislated for that. And but if we had, say, car rationing, and as a result, you got lots of ugly cars because people think, well, this is the only thing I can afford, and so therefore I don't really have a meaningful choice. I'll get this one. Then you would also get demands for car design regulation, because then you would have a situation where there is clearly a discrepancy between what people say they like and what actually happens. And you can say, well, but clearly the developers are not delivering what people want. Look at it. Look at all the ugly houses they built. So therefore, we need more regulation to sort it out.
Yeah.
Same with minimum space requirements and all that.
Yeah. I imagine if we had sort of 80 years of incredibly strict rationing on the number of restaurants you could build, now there'd be a big campaign for regulations on tasty meals. In that, the market obviously isn't providing this. It's only providing either luxury meals or these, small untasty meals that don't meet demand. Yeah.
Oh, it's not so bad.
It is so bad.
Okay, well, I think we should probably now move on to our final topic, which has been coming up quite a bit in Britain over the last 6 months or so, although it's been an issue for a lot longer, which is freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So earlier on this week, the comedian, writer of Father Ted, Graham Linehan, was arrested as he got off the plane at Heathrow Airport for 3 allegedly anti-trans tweets that he made while in America. And this has created a sort of very substantial response from many politicians. Why has this case, Tom, attracted so much attention relative to, this isn't something that's unusual in the sense?
No.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so the chap in question is famous in a way. Father Ted was a beloved British sitcom, and so he has a certain amount of profile. I also think the fact that he was met by armed police coming off an aeroplane, that this was such a serious thing. And now, but bear in mind, like, police in airports are normally armed.
Yeah.
But there were 5 of them waiting for him as he got off the plane. This seems completely ludicrous and disproportionate. Could they have waited? And it wouldn't have made it any better, by the way, but could they have waited till he got home? Could they have called him into the station for a quiet chat or something? If you're getting off a plane and there are 5 armed men, maybe some women, standing there waiting for you to take you into detention, you're going to think, now this is like an arms dealer, or it's a terrorist, or it's someone who's wanted for murder, like a dangerous guy getting off.
Somebody's wearing shirts like this.
So, well, exactly, that kind of person, Kristian. I don't know what shirt he was wearing. Maybe that was part of the problem. But so I think that's part of it. Right, he's famous, and it was so obviously disproportionate. And by the way, whenever you're going to talk about one of these issues, I like to see what they've actually said, just to make sure. And again, I'm going to be sort of a free speech absolutist, but you pick your battles, because you might not necessarily want to defend the people who have said like something absolutely, truly disgraceful and horrendous. I looked at these tweets, and I mean, they're very mild, frankly. I mean, I can see why people would be upset in certain circumstances if they had certain views. But the idea that the police would look at these tweets, even if someone had complained, and think, oh, we'd better dispatch the lads to the airport to bring this guy in, it seems absolutely crazy to me. And yeah, he was apparently bailed on one condition, that he not go on Twitter, which may be good for his long-term health. I don't know. But here's the other interesting thing. So the government have said we don't criticize the police in operational matters, but we'd like to remind them to focus on the public's priorities, which is, pretty close to a slap
Well,
on the
there is some way they could affect on.
And then I think the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police came out and said, well, it's not our fault. The government should change the law.
Yeah.
Now, that seems a little bit mealy-mouthed to me, because the police do have a degree of operational independence. They can decide what to prioritize and what to not to prioritize. Would anyone meaningfully have complained if they had decided this is just a comedian saying something slightly off color on social media? We don't have to arrest him the minute he gets off the plane. I don't know. But look, I mean, free speech really is in a pretty shocking state in Britain. And it's one of those things that, Americans now are, because of Elon Musk and others, getting really worked up about. And they can overdo it a little bit. Like, we're not living in George Orwell's 1984 yet. But equally, this is a serious problem. It's a problem that's been bubbling up for a long time, which has been growing. And I do think now is just reaching a point at which it should prompt a backlash. And I'm interested to think about, what should that backlash look like in a productive way? How do we actually try and kind of enshrine the right to free expression in British law and everything like that?
Yeah, I wonder what the buildings regulations would be like for telescreens in the Orwellian sense. Probably it's not going to happen for that reason. But no,
on two sides.
In this case, this could even be a positive thing for free speech. I know that this sounds probably mad given the circumstances and everything, but it's not unusual that people get arrested for tweets. It happens several times a day. It's maybe it's a good thing that in this case it was a high-profile figure and that this was national news. It's some random nobody that you've never heard of, and you probably think, well, it's probably someone I don't want to defend, some Twitter troll. In this case, okay, this is a figure who is known nationwide, and this made news and in a way that other arrests don't. And it really, so that there was one paper, I think it was the Metro, which in order to illustrate how mad the situation is, they said even Owen Jones was against it.
I mean, to be fair to Owen Jones, oh God, this is going to destroy my career prospects at the IEA. But to be fair to Owen Jones, he has been, said some fairly pro-free speech things in the past. He's generally been opposed to prosecutions of people on speech grounds, even if he really hates them.
Yeah, fair enough. It is also, and he isn't the only one in this case. There were, of course, people who immediately defended the arrest. So Zach Polanski came out on Channel 4 somewhere saying, this is great, completely proportionate. But there is now a bit of a change where, say, a year ago, you would have had quite quickly an alignment where if you're progressive, you defend measures like that. If you're not, then you don't, and you say this is taking us into an Orwellian direction. This is no longer quite so clear, because I think even some people on the left are realizing it isn't so clear anymore that it will always be our opponent. So that there is also Novara Media of all places. They had an article on this a few weeks ago where they were talking about, we now have the situation where people who say things in defense of Palestine action, that they can get into trouble with the police. And I think this was the first time that I ever unironically shared a Novara Media article, so not with the intention of making fun of it, but because they showed that there's something systematic going on, which is that the terrorism laws initially just referred to membership of an organization. So obviously, if an organization is proscribed, then you can't be a member of it, or you can't fund the organization. But you can say you were previously able to say things in support of it. So you were allowed to praise the IRA or whoever. And that has gradually been widened. Now just expressing support for it can already get you into trouble. And that is clearly a form of overreach where it does get into freedom of speech matters. And so, I guess the only hope for free speech is that we get a bit of a cross-ideological coalition in support of it. That some people on the progressive side realize we may not always be on the winning side here.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when you get a government next time maybe next time, who knows, if they're actually in favour of free speech, if they really mean it, I think they do need to think about whether you can entrench some kind of protection for free speech in British law. And, I know, Parliament can't bind its successors, parliamentary sovereignty and all of that, but I think you've seen very clearly the legacy of the 2000s and maybe other things going back further, where governments can very successfully entrench certain key values for them in the law in a way that it affects everything else going forward. And so you see the Human Rights Act or the Equality Act and the Climate Change Act, and there are lots of different examples. Is there something we can put down clearly in black and white that just says you have a right to free speech in Britain? Now, there is a right to free expression in the European Convention on Human Rights, but it's incredibly weak. It basically says in the second line, of course, government can restrict this for more or less any reasonable purpose. We need to have something more than that. And I think that, this is because you can say, why do we need any kind of legislated protection for free speech? We didn't used to need one. We had a sort of common law right to do what wasn't prohibited, and the prohibitions that were there, although you would say that, blasphemy laws and various censorship schemes that we've had at various times are infringement on free expression, and maybe they shouldn't have been allowed, but it wasn't that bad until recently. But I think we live in a world where speech is basically sort of weaponized online. Everyone is always just on tenterhooks waiting to pile in on someone who has said the wrong thing, whether it's on the left or on the right, and try and kind of humiliate people for it. And politicians will respond. And so I think, in a sense, you can say, let's just have a sort of self-denying ordinance. Let's have all the politicians agree that they're not going to tear lumps out of each other over free speech issues. But frankly, that's not going to happen. I think they need something which will actually tie their hands to a certain extent, and something that they can point to when you're on the media or, you're giving a speech or a press conference and someone says, so-and-so said this disgraceful thing. What are you going to do about it, Minister? You can just say, well, look, that's not something that we're going to get involved in because we have a protected right to free expression in Britain.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that note, I think we'll draw it to a close. You, dear viewers, also have a sort of protected right to free expression if you live in the US, so feel free to type what you like in the YouTube comments. But other than that, thank you for watching. Do remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.